I do indeed thank Your Honours for that consideration. And we did, in fact, have a short version prepared and a long version prepared. So I'll be reading from the long version, and that was specifically so that we could accommodate the redactions that have been so insisted upon, and we respect that, of course, by the prosecution. So I now turn, with respect, Your Honours, to count 2. And this concerns the alleged murders of high-value targets during the presidential period. And before addressing the individual incidents that the prosecution characterizes as involving so-called high-value targets, the defense makes a preliminary observation. The term high-value target appears throughout the prosecution's brief as though it is evidence of a coordinated plan to eliminate targets. With respect, that inference cannot be sustained. The existence of a prioritization category within a law enforcement campaign does not establish a criminal plan. HVT was an operational classification used by law enforcement, and in this sense, it is no different from a similar acronym in another country where I have clients. APOTS, or Australian Priority Organisation Targets. HVT is not a code for an instruction to kill or a witch hunt. It was a prioritization tool within anti-drug operations applied across regions and units on the basis of intelligence assessments, alleged position within drug networks, or inclusion on watch lists. Classification does not imply selection for murder, any more than it is proof of unlawful intent. The prosecution itself acknowledges the existence of formal operational frameworks, including police structures. Within those structures, individuals could be designated high value for purposes of operational attention. Many HVT operations, in fact, resulted in arrest or surrender, albeit some resulted in triple encounters. For this reason, each alleged HVT incident must be scrutinized on its own evidentiary foundation. When the incidents falling under count 2 are examined individually, the pattern we submit is similar to those incidents falling under count 1. Namely, heavy reliance on insider testimony, wishful and selective reading of police reports, and dubious and tenuous linkage to Rodrigo Duterte. Now, the operations cited under count 2 were conducted within the framework of the lawful war on drugs, and as such, operational contexts are consistent with planned law enforcement activity, including buy-bust operations and coordinated arrests rather than preordained killings. The evidence for count 2 incidents consistently shows that the deaths occurred during armed confrontations in which force was used in response to an imminent threat, in accordance with the rules of engagement repeatedly articulated by President Duterte, namely that lethal force was permissible only where life was in danger. Across the count 2 incidents, there exist contemporaneous documents, whether it be arrest warrants, operational records, or firearms recovery reports, all of which reflect legitimate police operations that escalated into exchanges of gunfire. The general record does not substantiate a theory of wanton execution, yet the prosecution seeks to rely, once again, on the testimony of criminals spilling their hearts with a tacit understanding that they will never be prosecuted. In 4 of the 5 incidents, contemporaneous reports document the recovery of firearms at the scene, indicating that the weapons were used against police and prompting a responsive use of force. In incidents 12, 13, and 14, the operations were authorized by judicially issued search warrants. We have diagrams on the screen being shown. I'm not going to stop. They will be presented throughout my presentation continuously, all in an attempt to save time. Those circumstances are squarely within operational legality and fundamentally incompatible with a pre-planned murder. Incident 14 is particularly instructive. 4 individuals were arrested alive. To us, that demonstrates selective and not indiscriminate use of force. In incidents 10, 13, and 14, gunpowder residue was detected on the victim's hands. At a minimum, that forensic finding is consistent with an exchange of gunfire and not consistent with a straightforward execution narrative. And the prosecution and the victim's representatives simply can't have their cake and eat it. They can't say in one breath that drugs and guns were planted on victims and therefore dispute crime scene evidence, while at the same time complaining about the lack of crime scene evidence. Yet the prosecution virtually disregards these objective and forensic indicators in favor of narrow and often uncorroborated insider testimony. This is best illustrated in Incident 10, which rests almost entirely on P1160's assertion that a firearm was planted at the scene of the crime, and the official report fabricated. Yet P1160 expressly accepts that he did not witness the planting of the firearm and merely assumes that it must have happened, before conceding that the firearm may already have been present. Once again, we are in the realm of inadmissible conjecture. We know that an investigation followed that incident. The opening of an inquiry is not consistent with the intention to conceal wrongdoing. Beyond that, as I've just mentioned, the record reflects the detection of gunpowder residue on victims' hands in this particular incident, a forensic indicator consistent with an exchange of gunfire and inconsistent with the witness's testimony, which is notably, once again, uncorroborated. Incident 11. This is the sole incident in count 2 where direct linkage to Mr. Duterte is advanced. And this linkage rests entirely on voice recognition by an individual who claims to have overheard a telephone conversation and recognized the president's voice while being physically moved from one location to another. The alleged recipient of the telephone call himself was never interviewed, and another person present, on whom the prosecution relies for corroboration, did not hear the conversation. After all, would it not have been an item of interest to all those present in that specific location that the President of the Republic himself had condescended to discuss matters of such a criminal nature by way of telephone? So the ridiculous assertion stands solely on the word of one single individual. The only other corroborating witness, the one who heard nothing, acknowledged a personal resentment that he harbored for the then president, Rodrigo Duterte, for reasons you will find in PHL OTP 000164220-R01 at 0022, lines 695 to 708. Once again, I can't mention the reasons because it's redacted. Voice recognition in uncontrolled conditions, while being physically moved, and uncorroborated by any forensic or documentary evidence, cannot constitute substantial grounds for confirmation, particularly where it forms the sole mechanism for attribution. Incident 12. This incident relies heavily on a central witness whose credibility is seriously compromised by retaliatory motives he admits to harboring against Mr. Duterte. This can be found in OTP tab 55 at page 27. Line and another reason that we cannot mention in open session, but which can be found in PHL OTP 000-15167-R01 at page 0008. For this particular incident, the case record demonstrates that this operation was conducted pursuant to a judicially issued search warrant, with operational reports and documentation concerning the recovery of firearms. To display such an extensive contemporaneous record, one would expect the prosecution to produce forensic evidence capable of undermining the reliability of these materials, evidence demonstrating fabrication or inconsistency sufficient to reduce their probative value. None, however, has been forwarded, because none presumably exists. Incident 13. This relates to the killing of Mayor Espinosa, whose name I can mention, and Raoul Yap, who was shot in a police cell. The prosecution's case is largely premised on a witness who claimed to have heard, but admitted not to have seen anything. Thus, there is nothing in the prosecution's evidence to contradict the alternative theory proposed for this incident, which is that there was a firefight between the victims and the officers in the police station Leyte sub-provincial jail. Nor is there a need to enter into these conflicting accounts, because the prosecution's own evidence exculpates Rodrigo Duterte for responsibility for this incident. Not that he admits any connection to it. After all, according to the prosecution, on 1 August 2016, Rodrigo Duterte gave Espinosa a 24-hour ultimatum to surrender. And surrender he did the following day. 4 days later, Rodrigo Duterte commended Espinosa for surrendering to Ronald de la Rosa, commenting that it was just as well that he did. So if we look at it from the point of view of Rodrigo Duterte, that is where the incident ended, despite Mr. Jeremy exhorting us to believe otherwise. What happened thereafter, as awful as it may be, had nothing to do with our client, and not one witness can say that. The prosecution's narrative in Incident 14, the raid on the house of another person who I can mention, the mayor of Ozmis City, rests exclusively on a witness who, for reasons we cannot explain in open session, is wholly unable to provide complete or reliable testimony for reasons that can be found in D36, tab 181, lines 128 to 155, and lines 191 to 212. Contemporaneous documentary police reports reflect that this police operation proceeded pursuant to 6 judicial search warrants, something hardly consistent with a premeditated murder scheme. After all, if the intention was cold-blooded murder, why go to the bother of involving a judge? Official investigative materials also indicate that officers approached the premises, announced the execution of the warrant, and were met with gunfire that struck a patrol vehicle and injured an officer, prompting a return of fire. This directly refutes what Ms. Masita so categorically claimed on Tuesday, namely that none of the arresting officers were ever harmed during the operations. Transcript. T5, page 44, line 24. In every case, the victim was killed, and none of the arresting officers were harmed. The exchange of fire, as reported, is supported by the fact that gunpowder residue was found on 7 individuals, including on the mayor himself, and a paraffin test turned out positive on the person of one of the victims, indicating that he had discharged a firearm, something totally negating the gun plant theory proposed by the prosecution's only witness. It is also worth stressing that 4 individuals were arrested alive following the operation, and that one of them was subsequently sentenced to life imprisonment after the domestic courts rejected claims of evidence planting. That fact alone is not consistent with a theory of indiscriminate execution, but is rather consistent instead with arrest and prosecution within the boundaries of the law and not indiscriminate use of force. So to summarize, across incidents 10 to 14, count 2, we see absolutely no evidence whatsoever of any attribution to Mr. Duterte on the granular level, nor do we see any evidence of a mutually agreed course of conduct on the upper hierarchical level of government involving Mr. Duterte and his alleged so-called co-perpetrators. The record reflects police operations conducted at unit level, sometimes under judicial warrant. P1166 describes operational discretion resting with the local team leaders and characterizes planned killings as rare and locally motivated. P1066 clarifies that to neutralize, that word which has been heard so often in the last few days, neutralize referred to lawful enforcement, not killing, the prosecution's own witness. The Senate committee report refers to rogue uniformed police. To conclude, the evidence reflects decentralization, not control required under indirect co-perpetration. And for these reasons, confirmation on count 2 cannot stand. Now, I'm going to start count 3. We have until 10:30. I'm conscious of the time allotted to me. So count 3 relates to the barangay clearance operations during the presidential period. Incident 15 marks the beginning of the barangay clearance operations. Now, from this point forward, a familiar pattern emerges in the prosecution's narrative. The same modus operandi, to employ Mr. Jeremy's language. Routine buy-bust operations are recast as sham exercises designed to conceal extrajudicial killings allegedly ordered from some unspecified source from above. Mr. Jeremy claims a target was identified through the use of lists. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. As one witness, an intelligence officer, explains in his testimony, the use of lists is a normal standard procedure. Once validation was conducted on a person, X, a file on that person would be created as a result of intelligence operations. Then, so claim Mr. Jeremy and Ms. Croft, the target is murdered and reports are falsified and rewards are paid out. This, Ms. Croft suggested at transcript 5, page 23, lines 11 to 13, is the systemicity of the pre-planned attack. But this is not the case. The defense can point to contemporaneous official records generated across different units or organizations that show clearly that in the majority of these incidents, the evidence reflects legitimate law enforcement operations involving spontaneous and reported exchanges of fire and uses of force subjected to forensic and administrative review. These are not clandestine acts hidden from scrutiny, Madam President, but rather recorded operations consistent with self-defense in the course of policing. And where the evidentiary record supports competing inferences, including the inference of a lawful armed confrontation and the inference of an unlawful execution, well, and with this I will conclude, in dubio pro reo. 10:30.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kaufman. So I've understood that you would like to use the time that remains to you. And you still have 20 minutes, actually. I understood that you wanted to use that time. Yes, I would, but I'm not so sure if I can conclude in 20 minutes.
C'est possible. OK. Nous essaierons, madame.
Ouais, donc vous avez la...
Judge Motek, very well. It's still you. You have the floor. Proceed.
Across incidents 15 through 49, the chamber will repeatedly encounter contemporaneous by-bust or warrant-based documentation, reported exchanges of fire, gunshot residue findings, ballistic testing, immediate hospital transport, internal investigations, and in some cases, prosecution and conviction of officers. Against all of this evidence that you've just seen on the screen here, the prosecution offers single insider accounts of alleged stagings, uncorroborated assertions of weapons planting and nanlabans, unsupported by any forensic evidence, often speculative, frequently contradicted by the alleged co-participants, or yet, more often, complete silence from the alleged co-participants, as they were never even questioned about the incident. And most importantly,